Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another edition, episode 3 of the Independent Thinker Podcast. I'm Donald Broussard Jr. I'm very blessed and honored that you're able to listen to this podcast and comment accordingly. I Today's episode 3, um, as the politics turns, as I call it, we'll talk specifically about several things. So I wanted to I had an agenda and the agenda was pretty simplistic. I really wanted to talk a little bit, well, quite a bit, about the results of the New Hampshire primary. I wanted to talk a little bit about the possible VP candidates that Donald Trump and his team are looking at, and yes, I'm kind of foreshadowing some things I'll be saying in a few. Um, Also, talk quite a bit about the Biden Harris ticket in regards of what they have done, um, kind of tout them out a little bit, um, but also talk quite a bit about the black vote pertaining to a large swath, if you will, of black voters starting to decide not to vote in this particular election, or better yet, not providing their vote for the Democratic ticket and sliding over to third party candidates such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and um, or Dr. Cornel West, and very few, I do mean very few, Dr. Jill Stein. But I want to start off with something that happened the night of the primary, which was um, the day after the episode 2 of this podcast came on, which was that Tuesday. And I'm kind of combine a couple things together, if you don't mind me going this route. Um, as you well know, if you are in politics or know a little bit about politics, you'll know that um, Donald Trump won the New Hampshire primary um, over Nikki Haley, which it technically became a two-person race a few days before, um, with um, Ron DeSantis, and about 2 days prior, Asa Hutchinson dropped out the race. Yes, Asa Hutchinson was still in the race at the time, former governor of Arkansas. Um, they dropped out, which kind of led to a two-person race, which basically Nikki Haley wanted in the very first from the very beginning. Right, she was kind of hoping that several other individuals who were part of the race would drop out um, sooner rather than later. Um, that really didn't happen. But in New Hampshire, it was a two-person race: Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. Donald Trump won the primary 54% to 43%, 11% gap, which everyone knew it was going to be a double-digit win for Donald Trump. But I think the what is surprising, I'm going to get to the main reason I really want to talk about a particular subject in a second. This is pretty significant because keep in mind that the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries provide delegates, and those delegates are distributed based upon percentage and the gap, if you will, of the winner versus 2, 3, and so on and so forth. In this particular situation, um, for the Republican Party, you need 1,215 total delegates to receive the full endorsement, if you will, or be able to say, I am the Republican nominee for President of the United States. So 1,215, keep that number in mind. Currently, the delegate um, um, discrepancy or gap, if you will, is Donald Trump currently has 32. Nikki Haley has 17. Um, Now, there's going to be a couple of races, excuse me, is going to happen within about a week and a half. Yeah, about a week and a half, 2 weeks. Um, and those particular states do not have a lot of delegates centering it. Matter of fact, hardly any. To be perfectly honest with you. So recently, um, Nikki Haley has went to one of those particular areas. One is not a state. One that particular area, if not mistaken, is the Virgin Islands. Um, and um, they do have delegates, even though they do not have voting rights in regards of being utilized in the presidential race at all, because the territory is different, right? Now, by the way, there are delegates. There are 12 other delegates that was distributed prior to the New Hampshire primary, right after the Iowa caucuses. 9 of those delegates went to Ron DeSantis. 3 went to Vivek Ramaswamy. Will those delegates go to Nikki Haley or Donald Trump? No, it stays where it is. Just FYI on that. I digress. So the I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was thinking about something. So so now we have a situation, right? So here's a situation that's at play right now. Um, Nikki Haley needs to win quite a bit of delegates. She needs to win races, right? So let's kind of fast forward to February 8th. Yes, February 8th is an important date. Um, and February 24th. I'm get to why 24 is extremely important. But February 8th, there are delegates to be had in the state of Nevada and the Virgin Islands. Yes, Virgin Islands. Yes. There's 4 delegates to be distributed in the Virgin Islands and 26 delegates to be distributed from Nevada. The pundits and pollsters out there are stating that in Nevada, Trump will win significant margin. However, the distribution of delegates will be determined how well, if you will, Nikki Haley can quote unquote rise from the ashes. The Virgin Islands, however, is a little bit different. Um, Different demographic to a certain extent. Um, and Nikki Haley went to the Virgin Islands right after um, the primary. From what I understand, Trump did not go and will not go. That means if all in all goes to plan, at best case scenario for Nikki Haley, she'll get 3, if not all, the delegates for the Virgin Islands, which brings her total to about 2021. But she's going to be in a bigger gap when it comes to Nevada, um, because Trump is going to win in significant margin. And you're probably looking at a total of maybe 25 total for Nikki Haley to almost 50. And so for Donald Trump, and it kind of builds up to South Carolina, which in her home state, she is so far behind. it's hard to see her even coming close to 10 to 15, 10 to 12 point back. She's like really back, like 15 to 20 percentage points back. So it's going to be pretty tough um to um to surpass um Trump. And then you have Super Tuesday, which is March 5th. But in between that, you have Michigan for the Republican for I'm sorry, you have Idaho, you have Missouri, you have DC, and you have North Dakota on the second, third, and fourth of March. So that particular time frame, there's going to be quite a bit of delegates to be distributed by the Republican Party. Allow me to circle to where I really want to go in the beginning. It doesn't help Nikki Haley for trying her best to gain the votes and the admiration of the people in South Carolina when the governor of South Carolina and one of the senators from South Carolina endorsing Donald Trump. But not just any particular senator. We already know about Lindsey Graham, Tim Scott. And that's a hard pill to swallow because Nikki Haley was the governor that appointed um, um, Tim Scott to that particular position um, due to one of the senators leaving the race or leaving his position as senator of South Carolina. But outside of that, I'm gonna get to the politics part in a minute in regards of the future of the GOP, in particular the VP candidates for Donald Trump, because after Super Tuesday, it is going to be exceptionally hard for Nikki Haley to see a pathway to the presidency. I do believe that she will stay in the race even further than the Super Tuesday, but the pathway is nearly impossible for her if all goes to plan um and what prognosticators believe it will happen. But she can either cipher some votes away, or if Donald Trump is convicted or goes to trial and is convicted of these crimes, particularly within the DC race, in DC area, excuse me, the federal crime, that gives the pathway for Nikki Haley to be the Republican nominee. Now, we're already in January 29th. It's going to be tough for her to gain um that pathway, especially for the trial to happen, because this is going to be a very lengthy, detailed trial, not including the trial in Atlanta. But that's her only pathway. But I digress. Again, let me get back to the main point here. Tim Scott. I was going to do a Lanyap edition of the Independent Thinker, and I might do that. But I want to take about 10 to 15 minutes on what happened Tuesday in the New Hampshire primary. And if I ruffle some feathers as it pertains to my commentary regarding Tim Scott, I don't care. Um, you'll get over it. Tim Scott is the picture perfect definition of a walking minstrel show. It's the truth. I'm gonna give you an example in a second. You know, I was sitting back in my office and I was looking at at several different channels. Um, so I had my television, I had two of my iPads on, and I had NBC, I had CNN, and I had ABC News. Um, and they panned to um, the speech to Donald Trump. Let me give you a quick caveat to this part, real quick, little little side bender. On one of my computers, I was watching in the background Fox News, and Hmm. and listening to Kellyanne Conway saying that we, this is her words, will see Donald Trump, she said President Trump, be very gracious in winning. And the other little sycophant, Sean Hannity, said the exact same thing. Yes, he will be gracious in his victory. And they panned to the speech. I had to cut them off because they were saying some other nonsense. Um, and one of the very first things that he did, Donald Trump did, was literally go off on Nikki Haley about her looks, about who she is as a person. And then you saw Tim Scott officially endorse it. And I was infuriated, not because he endorsed Donald Trump, because I knew that was going to happen eventually, but it was how he did it that irked the living holy heck out of me. Let me repeat that. It's how he did it. And he invoked a phrase from one of the most amazing, powerful um, women who happened to be a black woman and invoked her phrase in one of the most ridiculous, I'm trying not to curse, most ridiculous manner I have ever seen. And this is why I say that he is the walking definition of a minstrel show. Take a look and listen to exactly what he said. It, okay. We need a president who will lower our taxes and not raise our taxes. We need a president like Donald Trump. We need a president who understands the American people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. We need to that, right? Fannie Lou Hamer is probably turning around in her grave right This reminds me of certain people, and I'm going to even put it out there, certain Republicans who love to invoke Martin Luther King Jr. quotes, but never talk about the context of the quotes that he gave. They love to cherry pick because they're too ignorant, too stupid, too lazy to read the entire quote and to understand why the quote was given. Tim Scott did the exact same thing to this wonderful woman's phrase. And I bet if you ask Tim Scott right now, why did Ms. Hammer say those words? He wouldn't know a damn thing about it. And it's upsetting because he should know. He should understand the context of the quote, the reason why she said those words on television. He has always been a disgrace in regards to Tim Scott. But when you officially on national television in front of the United States, which by the way is also going throughout the world, by the way, that you have just officially sold your soul for some notoriety, you can't come back from that. There's a lot more I want to say. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to save it for the Lanyard episode that I'm going to have later on this week. But it is extremely important to understand that he is trying his best to get in the good graces of Donald Trump to hopefully become his vice president. And to be quite frank with you, I'm going to go ahead and say it now. And I'm going to quote Mr. Bakari Sellers, who said something which I laughed for at least 5 to 10 minutes. I thought it was the most hilarious thing I've heard. Bakari Sellers or said this on CNN about Tim Scott. That's a lot of ass kissing to be the HUD secretary in his cabinet. Let me repeat for those in the background who's going to be listening to this podcast. Bakari Sellers on CNN stated, and I quote, "That's a lot of ass kissing for him to be the HUD secretary in his cabinet." He has now become Ben Carson 2.0. This, while he's trying his best to be the vice presidential candidate for him, which kind of segues into my next point, is the possible vice presidential candidates for Donald Trump. One happens to be Tim Scott. Now, he's doing several things. Number one, he just supposedly got engaged. Um, congrats. Um, to a woman. To a woman. Um, whether the engagement is sincere or not, wink, wink. He is trying his best to cozy up to Donald Trump and his team to be the vice presidential running mate for him. Um, Now he has voted on every single issue that Donald Trump wanted Congress to pass, when Congress was dominated by the Republican Party 100% of the time. He has opposed every single Democratic piece of legislation. He was for a um, a quote unquote new civil rights act, if you will, that kind of dictates in regards of police brutality, funding for the police, and so on and so forth, putting police officers and police stations and all police agencies with specific rules and ramifications if things doesn't go a certain way, like camera, like body cams, and making sure they protect the rights of individuals themselves. He was for that concept and for stringent um, bill that would technically defund certain police departments if they don't follow certain rules and guidelines. And then eventually, he backed away from it, and you never heard about it until President um, Donald Trump signed a placated piece of legislation um, regarding that. But you never heard anything else at all about this. He is the prototypical sycophant. He will do anything in the world he can do to either maintain or gain power for his own benefit. So you have Tim Scott, who is in the running, I guess. Um, I would say he's more of the HUD secretary, to be quite frank with you. Another particular person who I believe is at the top of the list is Elise Stefanik, who is technically the number two. I'm sorry, the number three in the House Representatives. Um, Elise Stefanik, out of New York, was literally considered a moderate Republican. She was considered a moderate Republican until you start to see the tides turn a bit for more to be more of a Trump supporter, a sycophant, if you will. And it got to the point where she made a statement about January 6th and the responsibility that Donald Trump had on her website. Then it got scrubbed off her website to, of course, placate to Donald Trump. Um, so she was a moderate. She didn't like Donald Trump before. Now she's all in love with him and has fought for him and his and want many of his bills in regard to his vision for bills, excuse me, to be front and center and do everything and anything that he says. Technically speaking, she is kind of on the top of his list based upon a lot of prognosticators and quite a bit of the people who are on the inside of his um his campaign. Another particular person who has come about, ironically, is the current governor of Arkansas. And I'm gonna get to a bit of a run of governors. Um, there's two governors and a senator, and a couple other people to get into. But the first governor is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and she was the former communications director for the White House under 45 administration for about 18-20 months his uh, of um, of President Trump's tenure. Um, then came in Kayleigh McEnany, but she is the daughter of former Governor Huckabee, Huckabee, and she is on the forefront of the culture war situation. Um, so she um she has done several things that's kind of weird. Um, she has done an executive order to ban um gender neutral words from being used in government buildings. I can't make this up. You got to look for it. I'm gonna post it in the description below to so you can see what she has done. She has literally banned certain words that shouldn't be used because it propagates um, this concept um, of gender roles that gender roles are going to be diminished if we use these words specifically when it comes to um, this. Um, so that's her in a nutshell. Um, she has banned AAP African American Studies in Arkansas to be used as actual Carnegie units to graduate. So, but by the way, it's okay for AP European history. Little FY. Um, so these are you know, books banning and so on and so forth. She's at the forefront. The next governor is Governor Christy Nome of North Dakota, who, quite frankly, um, she is probably one brain cell above Sarah Palin, maybe two, and that's not saying a lot. Um, she hasn't really done anything dramatic or or, or forward moving, if you will, for the Republican um the Republican Party. Um, she is can be considered like a blank slate, if you want to call it that. She has been on the forefront during the pandemic to keep her state open, but then again, it's North Dakota, um, population 25. So it's not a huge ordeal to a certain extent in regards of the pandemic situation. But just like any state during the pandemic, there were significant peaks, plural, of individuals within North Dakota getting sick, severely sick, by the way, during the COVID situation in 2020. And that um, was harmful to her. But more importantly than being harmful to her, she used this concept by saying, "Look, people are going to get sick, um, but we're moving fast within the state to provide the necessary medication that they need. Um, but we can't allow our state. This is her words. We can't allow our state to be closed. I'm reading it here to be closed and lose um, the revenue that our state needs and the income that our North Dakotans need to survive on a daily basis. We will not close our state." It's her words. So look, it's another candidate. Would do I believe she would be the candidate to run with him? If he really wants a blank slate type of candidate, a complete blank slate, sure, why not? But I'm also going to keep in mind that some of these candidates, like Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Tim Scott, Christy Nome, they can't hold a candle to debating against um, Kamala Harris. Just can't. At least they're finally just going to be loud. Just going to be obnoxious. Just like many New Yorkers. Uh, no offense, but it's the truth, right? She's going to be loud, boisterous, obnoxious. and she's going to say some things that are going to be total lies and fabrications, but she will come up and fight the fight. Christy Nome does not have that in her. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is can't hold a candle to her. Um, Tim Scott is Tim Scott. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. Um, so that wouldn't work either. Then you have another individual who is similar to Elise Stefanik, who was against Donald Trump running in 2016, eventually came around to doing everything he can, similarly to Ron DeSantis, to gain the respect and the ire of Donald Trump, worked toward to get his endorsement. Heck, Donald Trump himself said JD Vance has been kissing his ass just to get the endorsement, which is true. He couldn't even say anything. Matter of fact, Trump said that to his to a group of individuals at a rally in Ohio in front of JD Vance. No, he got the endorsement. He won, but would JD Vance out of Ohio be a candidate, a true candidate for the running with Donald Trump? Couple things. Number one, um, JD Vance isn't the most popular guy in Ohio, but he does have this sense that he can rally Republican voters in large numbers, not enormous, but pretty large numbers in Ohio to vote because it did it for him. Um, and plus, Ohio, even though it has went red for the past couple elections, he can literally solidify Ohio. And I think that's much more important because keep in mind, Kristi Noem is the governor of North Dakota with 3 electoral votes. It's going to be red no matter what. Um, Tim Scott is in South Carolina. It's going to be red no matter what. I want to say it's like 13 electoral votes. At least Stefanik is in New York. Now, New York is going to be blue. And at least Stefanik isn't the most liked person throughout New York. In her particular district, she is, to a certain extent. But yes, I think that's much more of a possibility as opposed to a Kristi Noem or, good Lord, a Tim Scott, or even a Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas, which is going to be red no matter what. And it's not a lot of votes in regards of electoral college electors that they would get. Um, he needs someone who can solidify a large state in regards of electoral votes. And I think JD Vance is a candidate, a significant candidate in that nature. Um, then that leads into someone who is so far gone. I don't foresee I don't foresee her being a running mate. I do see her in the cabinet, and that's Carrie Lake. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, you can't be, you got to be joking, Donald. I'm not. Hear me out. I'm not saying she is going to be a good running mate, because quite frankly, she wouldn't be. However, knowing the tendencies of Donald Trump, he wants someone who is going to be a stickler for him, who is going to call out Democrats, who is going to fight the fight that he likes, and will say some of the most outlandish things in order for the voice to be out there. Carrie Lake is that person. She is not a politician. She's not good at politics. I will grant to you, yes, she barely lost the governor's race in Arizona. Um, I was talking to friends in Arizona about what is going on in your state regarding this woman, and some of them, I'm not going to name any names, they were like, people are people. They didn't vote for her. So people are look. She has this magnetic perspective that kind of mesmerizes certain people, specifically Republicans. When she speaks, she's very quote unquote photogenic. Then again, she's been on air for a long period of time as um, a reporter and an anchor um, for Arizona news stations. Um, she will say what she wished to say. She is going to be very boisterous about that. She'll be very passionate about it. She's going to be very wrong, but that doesn't matter to Donald Trump and his team. So while I believe she's not going to be a good candidate or a good running mate, she is still in line for it because she's able to provide these nuggets of disinformation um, the way that Donald Trump desires, and be able to try to stick it back to Kamala Harris in a debate. Um, and I think that's going to be important for him. But I will also put her towards the mid and bottom of the list. The last person to that is technically being considered for VP running, believe it or not, it's true, is Vivek Ramaswamy. Okay, I find Vivek swarmy and disgusting. Um, but because I find him to be that type of person, doesn't mean he isn't going to be a good representative for Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, the only difference between he and Donald Trump are one, Vivek is Hindu. Two, Vivek is brown. And three, Vivek is happily married, unlike Donald Trump. Those are the only three things that are different from them. I'm sorry, that's four. Vivek is much more, how can I put this? Articulate than Donald Trump. So I find this to be quite interesting. Number one, I don't believe he's going to have Vivek Ramaswamy as a vice presidential candidate. I believe he's one, if anything, he may be top four at best. I don't believe there are going to be certain people within that particular political party that's going to back a vice president that looks like Vivek Ramaswamy. I just don't. And why am I saying that? Well, you don't have to look very far. Number one, Vivek didn't even come close to even being third in the Iowa caucuses. Two, he wasn't well received by many of the people within Iowa or even in his own party. And three, you have to look any further than Nikki Haley. I mean, Nikki Haley changed her name to be accepted into this party. Her legal first name is Nimrata. Nimrata, excuse me. Nimrata. That's her legal first name. She changed it to Nikki to accommodate the people around her. I mean, heck, in 2001, if you watched the Lanyap edition on the podcast, I'm gonna put a link to that in the description below. On her 2001 voting card, which was pulled up by Mother Jones magazine and Mother Jones, I'm sorry, editorial staff, she considered herself white. She checked as white. Think about that. I mean, it's the Republican Party is not going to accept it. Now, I do see Vivek Ramaswamy in on his cabinet if he ever becomes president in regards to Donald Trump if he wins the general election. I do see him on his cabinet. But that's it. That's it. Now, the reason why I did say he would be top four is the fact that he's articulate, he's wrong on many levels, but he is going to literally fight back almost in a derogatory nature against Kamala Harris. And that is what Donald Trump loves. So there are a multitude of VP possibilities for Donald Trump. I would say number one on the list would be Elise Stefanik. I think number one on that list would be Elise Stefanik. I think number two would be JD Vance. I think number three might be it. It might be Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I'm looking at my list. Sorry. I think four is Vivek. Then you got Tim Scott, um, Christy Nome, and Carrie Lake. Um, so don't be surprised. Um, that number one, um, Nikki Haley is gonna lose quite a bit in this Super Tuesday, but she is gonna gain quite a bit of delegates. I think she's gonna win some. I don't like saying it, but it's the truth. She's gonna win some delegates in areas that's insignificant, such as the Virgin Islands, Guam, U.S. territories. I'll put it to you that way. She'll win some U.S. territory areas, and but I think she's going to lose in her state in South Carolina. I believe she's going to lose by more than double digits. I believe she is going to lose maybe more than 15 percentage points, which is going to be devastating. Um, but she's going to go through, as she said before, multitude of interviews on Sunday, such as Meet the Press and This Week with George Stephanopoulos, excuse me, in other areas and other Sunday television news shows. She's going to continue on throughout, and I think the goal for her is to try to be able to get to the point where hopefully he's no longer the candidate Donald Trump, that is, because he's been convicted. But if that doesn't happen by the time um, the um, the RNC convention occurs, um, you're going to see Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, and I believe it's going to be possible, more than likely, Elise Stefanik um, as his vice presidential running mate, um, or JD Vance as a top two um, in there. So that's how I see it. Um, Let me know in the comments what how you see it as well. Um, Next category, I know I kind of combined quite a bit together. I apologize. Normally, I'm a little bit more um, organized than that, but I really wanted to kind of get through those things in that particular way. The next part that I'm gonna talk about more will be the Biden Harris ticket. Um, you know, I find this to be quite interesting. Um, because I think the overwhelming problem that individuals are having with the Biden Harris ticket are in multitude of layers. They're in a multitude of layers. And allow me to explain what I mean by that. The Biden Harris administration can be summed up as invigorating and frustrating combined together. And the reason why I said it is because mm, there are a lot of legislation that falls under the Biden administration, even certain legislation that's on the cusp of moving on. And I'll get to that in a second. Um, that really is a feather in the cap for the Biden Harris team or administration. But at the same time, um, they and their team don't do a very good job of explaining the how and the why. They're pretty darn good at explaining the what and the who. But for the life of them, they their team is unable to effectively articulate the why and the how. Allow me to just go over a few things that the Biden Harris administration has done that you might not think at the forefront of your mind, but it's quite important to discuss. One, the administration pushed the Democrats and Republicans to come up with the American Rescue Plan in response to COVID-19. Now, whether you specifically like what they did or you don't, you have these mixed feelings about the vaccinations and so on and so forth. First and foremost, I don't care. But two, and much more importantly than that, if you're skeptical about the vaccine because Biden and mostly the Democrats push this piece of legislation go out there and you don't trust the vaccine, that means you don't trust Donald Trump and his administration previously because it was under his administration that the vaccine came about. I digress. One, under this concept, $1.9 trillion was in this American Rescue Plan specifically. The White House specifically Americans, sent Americans in low to medium income range a $1,400 payment to help fund basic necessities like rent and groceries for those um, who couldn't take care of their household because they weren't working for a period of time. Biden and his administration specifically also extended a $300 a week federal unemployment benefit for 9.7 million people. By the way, these are individuals who were fired, furloughed, let go in the middle of this pandemic so they can stay afloat. Statistics also show that the majority of the people who receive this extra $300 a week federal unemployment benefit and the $1,400 payments to go out, a large swath of them were white women. You don't have to believe me. The federal government says so. I'll put that in the description as well. Now, they also temporarily expanded the child tax credit program, which for some reason, many Republicans who are family oriented and family first didn't like that, but for families. Again, I'm getting off the subject. They allotted $7.25 billion for small business loans, which, by the way, forgave a large chunk, if not all of it, was forgiven, as well as $128 billion in grants for state educational agencies to make sure that one, teachers are paid, because I was a teacher, still am a teacher, but I was actually in the classroom teaching at the time. So they're able to make sure we can provide for our families, our own children, who we have. The Biden team also teamed up with the CDC to come across with even more COVID-19 vaccinations. Now, keep in mind, this particular piece of legislation passed the Senate 50 to 49, in the House 220 to 211 along party lines. So it shows how much Republicans, at least at that time, and maybe even now, care about the American people overall. Because many of you who may be watching this either have benefited or know people who have benefited from that $300 extra week federal unemployment they received that $1,400 stimulus check to benefit them in the initial stages of the COVID-19 situation. Then you have a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Remember when Donald Trump had infrastructure week, where he's just going to talk about bridges and so on and so forth, but do nothing about it? This administration did it. Now, many of you look at this who may be watching this infrastructure. What about my bridges and roads? I'm sorry. I want to be very clear about this. This particular bipartisan, that means Republicans and Democrats voted for it, includes $284 billion for transportation needs, which includes repairing bridges, roadways, increase and benefit public transportation, airports. Look at New Orleans Airport. While trust me, that money went there, and that airport looks immaculate. A whole lot better than the old airport from New Orleans. Good Lord, that airport was horrible. But I digress again. More for electric vehicles to make it much more beneficial, but also affordable for people who are looking to transition from a fossil fuel or gas powered vehicle to a more hybrid and electric car evolution. $65 billion for broadband. In other words, for internet. By the way, Chrissy, no, much of your state did not have internet. Now they do. You're welcome. North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Montana, areas of Iowa, areas of Kansas now have broadband. You're welcome. $73 billion for power infrastructure and $55 billion for clean drinking water. You don't think that's important? Why don't you go ahead and ask the people of Flint, Michigan, if clean water is important? Or ask the people in Jackson, Mississippi, if clean water is important. Matter of fact, why don't you ask yourself, if clean water is important or not. I would love to have people, those Republicans, those same Republicans who didn't vote for this piece of legislation, to go ahead and drink brown water. Go ahead and bathe or shower in brown water. Be my guest. You won't. I thought so. I'm gonna get to the main point in a few minutes. You also had the first major gun safety bill in decades. Now, I want to put this in a caveat. After the shootings in Uvalde, Buffalo, New York, and other places, I appreciate the fact that you want to give thoughts and prayers. I do. But many of you Republicans have been saying thoughts and prayers since Columbine and wouldn't lift a finger to try to work to rectify it. It's easier to rectify the immense amount of car accidents over 50, 60 years ago by mandating um car mandating GM and other car distributors, car makers with seatbelts, testing to get your driver's license, not just your regular driving test, but an actual test with answer choices and so on and so forth. Even an eye test in some cases to get a driver's license. But many Republicans will not even try to have basic or significant background checks. Just a background check is tough. This piece of legislation, while would save lives, is not the most end all be all of legislation. Matter of fact, Democrats were very upset with this piece of legislation because it didn't go even further. It didn't go further in regards of extensive background checks. It just limited magazines. It extended a little bit of the hold for larger weapons like an AK-47. It didn't do a whole heck of a lot, but in the eyes of the Democrats, it is. However, you have started to see a bit of some tangible effects of it. It's not the end all be all. It's a start, but you need to have a start in order to get to the finish line, if you will. You got to start somewhere. On top of that, you had the building of semiconductors through at home in the United States through the CHIPS Act. I don't think people understand the importance of this act. It allotted or roughly around 53 to 54 billion dollars in federal funding to manufacture semiconductor chips in the United States instead of relying on China to produce them. That means number one, more jobs are coming into America in regard to manufacturing. Two, we have the ability to rebuild our research and development mechanisms here, which was apparently going overseas in regard with other companies because of a cheaper rate to get these semiconductors. This is pretty important because it also provides us with a better supply chain in other countries. Countries going to now rely on us for semiconductors. They're going to rely on us for U.S. manufacturing, as opposed to United States going out for other countries and spending money to other countries while we can make money as well as keep our money home in the United States. By the way, Republicans didn't like that either. The Inflation Reduction Act is important. The Build Back Better plan, a massive social spending bill to the tune of $2 trillion. Quite a bit of that dealt with climate change. $550 billion, excuse me, was actually dedicated to combating climate change, paid in part by increased taxes for corporations and the uber rich. In other words, if you are the top 3 percentile of earners in the United States, you were taxed highly and heavily to help pay for this particular piece of legislation. So those particular individuals and companies and organizations like your Walmarts and your Amazons had to pay larger amount of taxes for this. Keep in mind, keep in mind that Walmart paid $0 in taxes several years ago. Walmart, Wally World, the place that most people like to go shopping at. That's true. You tax them a high rate to pay for this piece of legislation, while it won't come out the back end of middle to low income families. Republicans didn't like that. It was a 50-50 split tie in the Senate, and Senator, and I'm sorry, Vice President Kamala Harris had to break that tie. And it went along party lines in the House of Representatives with 220 to 207. That's when the House was ran by the Democratic Party. But it's not just that. Let me continue on with this particular piece of legislation. Almost 370 billion for a climate initiative to reduce greenhouse emissions. 300 billion in new revenue through a corporate tax increase. Corporations like Wally Worlds and your Targets, or as certain people might say, like my god sisters and other family members, Target, Amazon, and so on and so forth. They pay a higher corporate tax rate to help fund this particular piece of legislation, not on the back end of hardworking Americans like you and me. 80 billion of this dollar, 80 billion for the IRS, for new agents, modernize its technology. Keep in mind, the Republicans stated that the reason why they didn't want this is because you're going to have agents coming after the common man to get their taxes. Have you ever been on a call, or you call the IRS, and you've been on the phone seemingly for 865 days, 48, 21 hours, 17 minutes, and 12 seconds? Seems like you've been on the call with the IRS until you were almost dead and gone. That ends, because now you're going to have the money to hire IRS agents to answer those critical phone calls to deal with your tax dollars. A $2,000 annual cap for out of pocket prescription drugs, specifically for those insured by Medicare. In other words, you won't pay no more than 2 G's per year to see your doctor, to get your prescriptions, to do the things that you need to do to survive in this God-forsaken America. Republicans tried their best to go against this without true explanation. We continue on. Support for Ukraine's defense against Russian invasion. Look, I don't care how people might look at this. They may say we got to take care of home first. Let me explain something to you. When the United States or when the quote unquote big brothers don't get involved in global matters that try to rid democracy away from truly democratic countries, and you institute a dictatorship or authoritarian regime, when you take a country, what happens? It it metastasizes. It grows. Don't believe me? Go back in true history books into World War II, World War One. This happens. Many of you who watch this have friends, and you will fight your enemy to make sure your homeboy or homegirl is cool. Some of y'all will jump into fights because of your loyalty to said person or said people. Ukraine is an ally. Ukraine is a friend. Ukraine is critical piece to a democratic state in that particular area. The United States have no whatsoever reason to be involved. And by the way, we don't have troops going there. We're sending missiles, tanks, trucks. We're sending some of our military there in regards of strategic planning. We're not involved in the actual fighting itself. We lose a democratic state, we lose a piece of the world that becomes an ally to the United States. We lose a friend. Then, and by the way, that's just some of the other stuff that's happening when it comes to the Biden Harris administration. Environmental justice that's happening, protected 26 million acres of land and water throughout the United States, canceled the remaining oil and gas leases that's out there. That, by the way, that some of these areas are linked to carcinogens and harmful to black and brown neighborhood because many of these plants are smack dab in the middle of black and brown neighborhoods. If you don't believe me, go look at St. Charles and St. James and other parishes in Louisiana that have these areas that's harmful to the environment itself. You actually have clean energy projects that's happening that's currently going on right now. The Defense Production Act using the emergency authority on the basis of climate change to increase clean energy initiatives and technologies to benefit America, not just solar power, but also wind turbines, investment in hydroelectricity, EV cars and vehicles. Now, I bring this up because for some ungodly reason, the Biden Harris administration, specifically their communication team, has this propensity to not tout these things and not explain the how and the why. Here's what I mean. You have to go to these neighborhoods. You have to go to the people. You have to go to these schools. You have to go to these areas and explain why these pieces of legislation are important, not just to America, but more importantly to them, and how it affects them in a positive nature. This is not happening. I don't care what anybody tells me. It is not happening. You don't see this. You can go on any streaming network, streaming platform. You go on any single almost any single YouTube area or YouTube page or so on and so forth. When you if you don't have if you have ads, if you don't pay into YouTube to skip the ads, there are a multitude of Republican ads and disinformation that are out there. They are trying their best to explain to people that what's happening, these things that I just touted and talked about, are harmful, and it's the most vague perspective of all. It is the it is the responsibility of the communications team, both in the White House as well as the campaign of Biden Harris, to specifically tout and explain the how and the why, not just to certain people in communities, but to all people in communities, all people in certain areas, not just whites, not just Asian Americans, not just Hispanic Americans, not just African Americans, all people. And you have to have certain people who are able to talk the language, to speak the language within the community to explain this. That's not happening. And I'm saying if that does not happen, Biden Harris administration will be a one term presidency. This also leads to the perspective of why the black vote or many black folk are looking for an alternative. So the Pew Research Center um, had a study out about the black voter and the percentage of black voters. And I want to get to the main part here. As of 2022, 2 years ago, the study was finished, I think, in the middle part of 2023. As of December 31st, 2022, seven states, including, and then you add the District of Columbia, has the highest share of black eligible voters. Allow me to repeat this. Seven states plus Washington, D.C., has the highest share of black eligible voters in the United States. What are these states? I'm glad you asked. Texas, Georgia, Florida, New York, California, D.C., Mississippi, Georgia, Maryland, Louisiana. If you have a large share of the black vote in America within these particular states, the power of the black vote can literally turn the tide of an election. I'll give you a perfect example of how it can literally turn the tide in an election. In Louisiana, a couple of years ago, there was a race between the incumbent senator Kennedy and Gary Chambers. Now there were a couple other, Democratic uh, candidates, but I'm not going to talk about the Louisiana DNC. That's a whole different podcast to get into. I might do that as another episode for the Lanyap edition. So Kennedy won Louisiana with about a little bit over 600,000 votes. Gary Chambers came in a distant second. But the numbers were staggering in regards of black vote. Here's how. One, if only, if only 40% of black voters voted in New Orleans that were Democrats, by the way. If 40% of Democrats that were black voted in New Orleans, if 35% who were black voters voted in Baton Rouge, or just Democrat as a whole, but in particular black voters in Baton Rouge, about 25 to 30% within Lafayette, same amount within Shreveport. Gary Chambers would have won, and he would have been the Democratic senator from Louisiana. It seems like a lot in regards of percentage, but keep in mind, in 2022, it was literally the lowest turnout of black vote in Louisiana in years. If you had a good swath of black voters to vote in any of the states, you would have seen a significant difference. You don't believe me? Here's another example. Let's look at Georgia. In particular, the Atlanta area, Fulton County area. The large amount of black voters that came out to vote in the presidential election swayed the election, that election, from Georgia being red to blue. The same thing happened in Nevada, Arizona, black and brown vote. Now, I will grant to you, black folk in particular were not a monolith. We are far from a monolith. Before, there were a swath of black folks who were Republicans. Now they're Democrats, a good majority of it, mostly because of the Southern switch. No matter what Candace Owens says, there was a Southern switch. And that led to much of the quote unquote political chaos that you may see in the South. Black voters right now are disinterested in this election, not by not by some whim. It is the communications team in particular that has an issue in explaining the how and the why of what the administration has done that affects them. Number two, another reason why many individuals that are black folk are straying away because Congress and the push by the Harris administration did not push enough when it comes to gun violence in our neighborhoods. Did not push enough in regards of white supremacy in America. Did not push enough to reduce these economic gap between poor, middle class, and middle class to the rich. That gap is a huge portion of it as well. If The Biden Harris campaign and communications team and the White House team goes out into the community and explains to them, the American people, especially black folk, we do have gun legislation that's on the books. Here's what it does. I understand it doesn't solve the problem at hand, but this is a start. We can't get to the finish line until we have a start. It's the truth. You got to start somewhere. It's like dating. Your first girlfriend or boyfriend isn't going to be your husband or your wife. Not really. It's a start. You have to know who you are. You got to know what this legislation is about, what it does for you, why it does this, what would be the next step, how can we get to the next step, why this race is important. By the way, not just the president, but also the House races, your Senate races, also your state races. Why all this contributes to the Democratic Party needing you to vote. In exchange for your vote, this is what we are going to do. We are going to do ABC. We're going to tout this stuff. We're going to come to you. We're going to give you reports. We're going to explain this to you. They're not doing that. Pardon me. In regards of white supremacy, pardon me, sorry, get a little swig of water. On top of that, white supremacy has been on the rise, but not just white supremacy, Asian hate has been on the rise, specifically since 2020. Islamic and Hindu hate has been on the rise as well. Pardon me. And this is an issue within the black and brown community, in particular the black community. If we don't feel safe now, how can we depend on you to keep us safe? It hasn't worked yet. And by the way, don't come to me about black on black violence. We know that's a problem. There's been a problem forever and a day. But much of that problem is solved, or much of that problem is alleviated when you have opportunities, economic opportunities, when you don't redline, when there's no gerrymandering, when there is opportunities available for all, when you have a situation where jobs and careers are available to people, when you have a living wage available to all people, specifically black and brown people, you're not going to get some of this stuff. You're not going to get some of this black on black crime. You don't have to believe me. Statistics prove this. Polls prove this. Conversation proves this. But these things need to happen significantly in order for for black folk to vote a specific way, or majority of black folk to vote in a way that's going to be beneficial to themselves, their families, and their communities. You have to explain the how and the why, not the who or the what all the time. So you start to see a shift. With this shift, you also have the skepticism of these vaccines and medicine. You may be wondering why. The Tuskegee experiment is a prime example. Black folk are weary because they understand the perspective of the Tuskegee experiment and what happened during that time frame. it's a multitude of things that's going on, and that certain people like RFK Jr. are attracting more black votes. One, because he's appealing to them in regards of the skepticism for these vaccines. Two, he talks specifically about environmental justice overall, which he's a advocate for. Now, much of what his conspiracy theories are just plain wacko. However, when you can appeal to individuals in their vernacular about the problems that they're going through and the solutions, and here's how to get to this, they're going to gravitate to people to this. The same way that people have gravitated to Donald Trump will also gravitate to other candidates. Biden Harris administration and their communication team apparently don't understand that. They're literally trying to ignore RFK Jr. You do this at your peril. Why don't you ask the people who was around the late George Herbert Walker Bush about the late Ross Perot and how that worked for him? Do that. Ask them that. Then you also have Cornel West. Look, allow me to say this about Cornel West. Allow me to say this about Cornel West. I love the man. His book, Race Matters, was a game changer. Cornel West is one of the most thoughtful, intelligent, wise men I have ever watched, learned from, and seen. However, he has the gift of gab that can book black and brown people. You know what? You give him a platform, he is going to mesmerize the people. Now, I've spoke to people about how do you feel about Dr. Cornel West being in the race? Do you believe he can move the needle, even if it's a centimeter? I've heard so many people say they can't. He can't move it. He's not going to do anything. He's not going to. He's not going to have a platform. He has a platform. He has loyal listeners. He has a loyal fan base. He has friends, aka Tavis Smiley, who he can go on his radio show that's nationally known and syndicated to go out. He can go. He can go on television. He's quite a bit normally on Real Time with Bill Maher. No matter how you look at him, he's on CNN at times. He's on other platforms. If he starts getting traction, he is going to cipher away votes from Biden Harris. Maybe a few from the Trump era, maybe a couple here and there. But he's darn sure going to get away from get some from Haley as well. Now I'm not going to worry about Jill Stein because I don't believe she is actually credible. She has ran three particular races, and the only race that really had a significant difference was in 2016. But you had a confluence of issues overall because you had two of the most despised people in presidential history running for president, particularly in when it comes to Hillary Clinton, and much of those votes went to Jill Stein because of it. But that's beside the point. You don't have a situation like this. You have a situation where you have a communications problem, not truly a likability. And also, black folk are concerned about the quote unquote respect and role regarding Kamala Harris. Now, I don't care what people may say about Kamala Harris previously or her record when she was an attorney general in California. I don't care about all that. She is now the vice president of the United States, the first female vice president of the United States, the first African American in as VP in the United States, the first Asian Pacific background person in as vice president of the United States. She has broken barriers over and above. Same thing with Barack Obama. However, don't care about the background of all that right now. Care about right now. What's going on right now in the past few years. Much of the black folk who, especially like people who I've talked to, even in some instances, her own sorority sisters of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated truly believe that Biden and his group have not supported her and her team as much as others vice presidential individual vice presidents had before from their president. And some black folk look at this as a betrayal. You look at her differently, as many people are saying to me. So why would I trust you if you treat one of our own this way? That's an important factor to think about. Too many individuals right now, in regards to the black community, are concerned about this. And they're saying it in droves. There is a disconnect. There aren't legislations out there. Oh, by the way, let's not even talk about the perspective of student loans. No one is touting the fact that just recently the Biden Harris administration got rid of several $100,000 worth of student loans. Now, the messaging on that was bad, and the continuation of it is worse. I would have done it a little bit differently, but nevertheless, black folk in particular look at this and like, yeah, some individuals benefited, but not a good swath who really needed this particular saving, if you will. So you get all these things are happening, but in particular, the communication is bad. You're not going after them and holding your feet to the fire and explaining the how and the why, and to say if we once we do this, we're going to explain the how and the why even further. We're going to continue the communication with you. Black folk are the most loyal folk out there. No matter how much of injustices our people have went through and still going through, we're pretty loyal. Matter of fact, we're real loyal. The Democratic Party, in particular, this administration, needs to recognize that and not capitalize on. All right. With that being said, that was a lot. It was heavy. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. It's much longer than my other podcasts that I had, especially the Lanyap one. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast, um, and be thoughtful in with this podcast. And hopefully, I kind of open up your mind a bit when it comes to this. Any questions, comments, or concerns you may have, please let me know in the comments. I do read them. I do take them into account and try to be better for the next podcast and continue on from there. Thank you for your time. I'll make sure I put all of the links in the description below for you to see the information that I've researched and used within the podcast so you're able to make your own decisions. And remember, continue to be an independent thinker. God bless.